Won't schedule extra sitting days to deal with the Banking Royal Commission and also to protect North Queensland flood victims who put in insurance claims. Now, Labor announced this morning that it's got draft laws for 5 changes to the financial system in the wake of that Royal Commission. And they say that could be legislated this week. This is obviously about putting high levels of political pressure on the government. In fact, I thought the Prime Minister was getting quite cranky at the questions, accused Bill Shorten of playing politics on this. Now, Bill Shorten's changes would remove the exemption for insurers from fair claims handling provisions in the law, also removing the point of sale exemption for some credit products and also ending grandfather commissions a year earlier than the government intends. So they're the changes. Labor says, look, we've got, QCs on this. This is robust, good law. It's not contentious. The government says, well, we're going to do this our way and we're not going to schedule the extra time. So, look, more theatre than anything else. I don't think Bill Shorten really thought today that he was going to get his laws prioritised by the government, but by revealing these laws and saying Labor had got onto these laws, he's trying to change the conversation and also say that Labor wants to move on this and try to expose the government as not being interested. Now, to be clear, the government says we're working on it and we will do it. So a bit of a political argy-bargy more than anything, Gemma, but I think the theatrics around this are important because for Labor it's about framing the government as being too slow to act.
And also in question time today, the newly independent MP Julia Banks asked Health Minister Greg Hunt what he's doing to address environmental issues. Firing a bit of a shot?
Oh, look, I thought it was one of those moments, wasn't it? Now, let's remember who Julia Banks is. She's running as an independent in Mr Hunt's Victorian seat of Flinders at the next election, and she chose him to ask a question to. So it was all, I thought, a pretty intense moment, really. It was her first question as a crossbencher since leaving the Liberal benches, the Liberal side, becoming an independent, sitting on the crossbench, and of course she's become very close to the other crossbenchers. They work very closely together. And her question was, could the minister explain to the people in my electorate of Chisholm why he's not taking action on climate change, on environmental issues and health, was kind of the link she tried to make. Greg Hunt, tried to seem like he didn't care. I'm sure he does care because, of course, she is challenging him in his seat. And let's not forget, Gemma, that moment that Malcolm Turnbull said that she was a fantastic candidate, the former Prime Minister. And, of course, he's not a great fan of Greg Hunt's. In fact, whenever you ask Malcolm Turnbull, he says that Greg Hunt should answer questions because Greg Hunt was part of that push to get rid of Malcolm Turnbull as Prime Minister. So all of that's going on. And at the same time, Labor trying to push its points about banks and being a bit resistant, I suppose, to wanting to talk too much about the other issues the government's been wanting to focus on, which is border security. I want to bring in Anthony Albanese now. He is the Shadow Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Cities and Regional Development, but he's actually been key in really arguing the case for Labor on some of these Medivac changes. He joins us now. Hello, Anthony Albanese.
Good afternoon, Patricia.
Now, the opposition leader, Bill Shorten, says he's fine with asylum seekers transferred from Nauru and Manus Island being treated on Christmas Island. Are you fine with it?
Well, it's a matter of just making sure that we get appropriate care. For some people who have been able to get care on Christmas Island, if they require, though, care in other destinations, it should be a matter of listening to the doctors. That's the key principle here that Labor has adopted, and we must remember the political nature of the decision to reopen Christmas Island. I mean, the legislative changes from last week do not make a single change to border security measures which are there. They don't apply to anyone who comes to Australia by boat at any time now or into the future. There is no dismantling of any of the systems that the government says will stop people coming. So this is quite absurd, really, by the government.
Sure, but yesterday your immigration spokesman, Shane Newman, described reopening Christmas Island as unhinged. But Bill Shorten says it's fine for medical transfers to go there. I mean, how can you argue both lines?
Well, the fact is what Shane Newman was saying is that the government doesn't have a reason to justify reopening Christmas Island.
Then why do you think it's okay for these people to go there?
And indeed, in terms of Indonesia, the message from Indonesia is that the people smugglers paid no attention to the legislative changes last week, but they have paid attention to the government signalling through the reopening of Christmas Island that somehow something has changed. This is a government that's just playing politics with this. We'll see what actually happens in practice. We know that more than 900 people, if you take into account those people directly needing medical assistance and their families, have been transferred to Australia by this government. And we know that 900 is more than the number of people who are on either Manus or Nauru.
Okay.
So this is a government, really, that's just all about politics. It's desperate.
So
it's
do you still
desperately looking for...
Do you think it's unhinged to open Christmas Island?
I think it is a very strange decision of which the government has not justified this decision. It's all about them trying to play politics and send signals. And, you know, this is a government that is desperate.
OK,
it's very
you
desperate.
say you don't think it's a good idea, and yet Bill Shorten today, he's the opposition leader, he says he's fine with these people to be transferred there.
Well,
so how can you argue both? I mean, that's inconsistent.
Well, there's no inconsistency there. It's not our decision to reopen Christmas Island.
Wouldn't you oppose the transfers as well, then, if you think it's a bad decision to reopen it?
Well, people will be transferred to places to get appropriate medical care.
Well,
and,
Christmas Island is where they're going.
Well, no. If you actually have a look, Patricia, forget about the headlines that the government's looking for. Listen to what they said in Question Time today, which is that if people need medical assistance in other places, then they'll be sent there. So this is a government that's all about politics, all about signalling, not about substance. It's lost control of the parliament. It's desperate to pretend that the legislation last week is something that it is not. In fact, what the legislation last week did was simply codify a practice that the government itself says it has been doing by having 900 either people directly getting medical assistance or their families here in Australia.
OK, but the Department of Home Affairs recommended the reopening of Christmas Island. I mean,
well, you know, we'll wait and see.
No, but that was Senate estimates. The head of the department, Pizzolo, has said that.
I understand what bureaucrats say from time to time, and I understand the consistency that's there, and I understand that they're accountable to the ministers who appoint them. But
so you're saying he was doing the minister's bidding?
I'm not saying that at all. I'm simply pointing out a fact that in the Westminster system, it's ministers who are accountable for decisions that are made, and they shouldn't hide behind bureaucrats when they're making such political decisions.
Do you accept, though, that it was a recommendation of the Home Affairs Department?
I don't know whether that's the case or not.
But why would Pizzolo say it was if it wasn't the case?
Well, this is a very political issue. I don't know the circumstances. What I do know is that there hasn't been a single change to our border security laws for any new arrivals. I do know that there is an enormous cost behind reopening Christmas Island, and I know this, that the government's quite prepared to spend taxpayers' money in order to seek political advantage. And I do know this also from Senate estimates, that what we know is that in a range of areas of contracts, be it the whole Paladin issue, other issues with regard to the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, this is a government that's prepared to make decisions amounting to hundreds of millions of dollars, and in some cases it has $1 billion figure next to it, on the basis of very much decisions which aren't transparent and which require further analysis and for us to find out exactly what the processes are for some of these decisions, including, of course, the granting of a many hundreds of millions of dollars contract to a company that was registered in a beach shack on Kangaroo Island.
Karen Phelps says it's a subversion of democracy, as the intention of the Medivac legislation is to provide sick people in offshore detention treatment on the mainland. Is it a subversion of democracy to send people to Christmas Island?
Well, they should get the appropriate health care that they need.
Are you confident they can get it on Christmas Island?
And that should be the priority. Patricia, I'm not a doctor. The whole point of this was that we should be listening to medical experts, and I'm not the medical expert, and that's the whole point of the legislation. Let's stop politicians making those decisions in isolation from proper medical advice, whilst, of course,
should doctors be in charge?
Of course, taking into account national security issues and the advice which is there from the panel set up by Peter Dutton as the minister.
Should that panel be in charge of determining where they go, whether they should go to Christmas Island?
I'm not about to second guess medical advice here, Patricia. That's not my job. That, in fact, is I didn't do medicine at Sydney Uni. I did economics. So I'll stick to when it comes to giving advice on those matters. What drove the Parliament last week? The Parliament to make a decision on, after getting proper and appropriate advice, was the need to respect the fact that we as Australians have a responsibility for people who are in our care to listen to expert medical advice.
Just on another issue, actually putting your economics degree hat on, Labor has released draft laws for 5 changes to the financial system in the wake of the Royal Commission, and they would see lots of changes, but Labor still hasn't actually given a full response to the Royal Commission and whether you're going to implement the recommendations in full. In fact, I spoke to the relevant minister, Claire O'Neill, and she actually said she'd have a response within a week, and it hasn't been delivered.
Well, Patricia, this is Labor once again leading from opposition. We've put forward 5 proposals. That's 5 more than the government that has thousands of public servants at its disposal to draft legislation and has access to not just to the bureaucracy, but of course to advice from tax experts as well. We've said we will adopt in principle the recommendations of the Banking Royal Commission. We want the Parliament to sit to deal with these issues. I mean, we finish in 2 days' time and we're not back here until April, where we'll sit for 3 days. The government is introducing...
OK, but how can Labor demand the government legislate additional weeks of Parliament to allow more time when you haven't released your full response? And in fact...
We've got 5, Patricia. We've got 5
but
proposals.
Your full response, she said it would be available in a week, and I noticed Josh Frydenberg raised this.
That's 5 more than the government have, and we are leading from opposition.
So when will we get the full response?
We want additional... Well, that's the task of the respective shadow minister. We have put forward concrete proposals that will make a difference, including when it comes to insurance, based upon the recommendations of the Royal Commission, in the context that right now there are people in Townsville and northern and northwest Queensland who have been devastated by the events that have occurred there in those communities, that want to have the confidence in the insurance system based upon the recommendations that the Royal Commission have made. Now, this is just a practical response. Parliament can meet next week. They can meet the week after. We can debate what changes should be made in both chambers. And I can't understand... Well, I do understand why, because the government is running away from parliamentary scrutiny. They're sitting 10 days in 8 months. That really isn't good enough. And if they're that bad and that incapable of legislating, then they should just go to the Governor-General, call an election, and then whoever wins the election will be in a position to move legislative responses to the Banking Royal Commission.
Anthony Albanese, a pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you. Congratulations on Bindi.
Yes, I do have a new puppy, thanks to you. And that was Labor frontbencher Anthony Albanese, who has been campaigning it's a bipartisan campaign, Gemma, with Darren Chester, who's a national, for me to buy a puppy, which I've done.